Wow, it's so nice to be back. It's been a while, and it's so nice to see such a full class on a Saturday afternoon. That's just, wow, I'm very impressed. Um, I agreed to do this in part because I am not offering the film course this term for various reasons, in part because they seem to refuse to find any funds to upgrade our rapidly deteriorating video lab, which is part of the reason for demonstrating two different kinds of film editing software this afternoon. So I'm going to, the first order will be, I have a little brief PowerPoint with some getting started pointers that apply to all video editing projects, and then I'll walk you through some Final Cut tutorials, and whether or not you're going to use Final Cut or not, the interior workings of both Final Cut and Adobe Premiere are very similar in terms of the way that you approach film editing. So what I can show you in Final Cut, simply using that one because I have some ready-to-roll case study examples that I have from previous student films that were rather complex, that would be too much trouble to duplicate, but you can see how they would work on Final Cut. And then we'll be demonstrating Adobe Premiere, which if you haven't downloaded it yet or don't own it yet, I don't suggest you all do it at once because you'll probably like blow up the bandwidth in this room. But you can get a 30-day free trial of Adobe Premiere, fully functional. You have to be running a 64-bit operating system or it won't work. And that would be the primary reason that we haven't bothered to put it on all of the lab machines, because they're not running 64-bit operating systems. So one of the things that you're going to look at today, and what has been very frustrating for me for a few years now, is such rapid changes in video editing software and cameras to the point of making it, I would say, a little bit frustrating to set up. Because it used to be in the good old days when I started the course in 2002, everybody had little mini DV cameras and they were recording their footage on little tiny tapes, 4:3 aspect ratio, and that was it. And about 4 or 5 years ago, occasionally you saw somebody come up with a nice HD camera, and then you see people coming with their footage coming from their DSLRs and from their little portable cameras and different kinds of video cameras, and there's I format and P format, and it gets to the point where you've got just really a dog's breakfast of all different kinds of video formats, and they all require something a little bit different in terms of processing. I sort of hit the wall about 4 years ago when I decided to go from my little mini DV tape camera, and I decided to, buy at that 4 years ago the top of the line Sony that was capable of doing 1080i, which is an interlace format, as opposed to P, which is progressive format, which is better. So, but this was top of the line. It was an AVC HD camera. I was very excited. The quality was terrific. I went to export my footage into Final Cut Pro, and between that and my old G5, it went, sorry. So I ended up saying, well, what Final Cut version will work? And I ended up with Final Cut Express 4.0.1. Great. Brought that home, went to put that on my computer, and sorry, that doesn't work on the computer. Ended up buying an entire new computer to run the software that would be capable of taking the footage off of my brand new camcorder. So, and it's just sort of gone from there. So I'll give you some basic starting points, number of different things. The first thing you have to do before you start one of these projects is get your files ready. It sounds, like a pretty boring thing, because a lot of the times when you're making a video, it's kind of an exciting project. You just want to get in and you just want to do it. And if you get in and just do it and you don't have your files ready, it will take you significantly longer. And if you've got all the time in the world, that's fine, but I think you're in a Philip Beasley studio and you don't have all the time in the world. You need to be able to do this in a relatively expedient manner. So get your files ready first, and I'll talk about prepping the files. And always remember, it's garbage in, garbage out. So if you shoot video and the light level is low and the quality is grainy and the color is crap, there is almost nothing you can do to improve that when you take it into your film editing software. It's unlike, you know, photographs. When you take them into Photoshop, you can catch something with bad lighting and you can sharpen it and you can make the color better. The problem when you're dealing with a film is that most of these are recorded at either 24, 25, or 30 frames per second. So every frame is equivalent to a picture. So if you can imagine, say in a 10-minute video at 30 frames per second, how many pictures that is that would have to be rendered up in order to fix the coloring. So you can mess with it a bit, but you're better off to make sure that you've got really good footage to start with. The other thing too is, unless you are steady as a rock or you're Stanley Kubrick, don't hand hold. If you can, I mean, you know, the Blair Witch Project look was maybe not fine for that film, but if you start to do a lot of handheld video, be really careful. That's all. If you do a lot of handheld video, it'll make people ill. So you're better off to try to do something with a tripod if you want it to look really good. Before you start filming, plan your film. Figure out what you want to do. A lot of people, like in the industry, actually storyboard the film, and you will find that if you start to storyboard the film, you will have better luck in doing a really good project, because when you're doing your filming, if you're looking at certain light, quality, situation, shots that you want to get, it's much easier to get that at the time than it is to go back and to try to replicate the situation. Because if you're cutting, for example, and if you're shooting something and you want a daylight film, and this time of the year, say you got up late, you started at 2, you finish at 5, the quality of the light is going to be so drastic from the beginning to the end of that if you start to splice pieces from the latter part of the afternoon into the beginning of the film, you're going to get really jarring lighting differences all the way through. So you're best to understand what you're doing, what you're shooting, and to plan it out. So plan your film, understand your sequence, get your media ready before you start to put it into the editing software. Make sure you have enough space on your drive to store the project. A lot of these raw footage is really, really huge. So make sure, particularly if you're running from laptops, which are famous for really not having very large hard drives, that you need to have, you know, probably minimum 20 to 30 gigs free in order to be comfortable. You've got to get your still images ready. If you're using a combination of video images and stills, you want to make sure your stills are prepped, and you have to check all of your formats for compatibility, and I'll go into that in detail, because one of the big problems I run into in the film course is at the end of the term I like to make a compilation video, and so I have somewhere between 14 and 20 individual films that I'm trying to bring into one timeline in order to make an archival disc. Well, these days I'll end up with probably 7 different formats of films in terms of their aspect ratios, the frames per second. Some people don't, you know, hand them in different file formats, and it's really a bit of a nightmare. So you want to make sure that within your own project everything's compatible. So when you're preparing your video files, there are different video formats. A format consists of 2 parts. There's the container, or the wrapper, and the codec. So the container will be something that you would see, say that it's the ending, the suffix on the file type, whether it's a .mov, which would be your standard Apple, .avi, which is your standard Windows base, MP4, which is sort of an intermediate media base. So that's the kind of file it is. So people generally will try to be working within a certain file type. Apple, as I say, if you're working on your Macs, you're probably going to be doing a .mov. If you're working on a PC, you can do .movs, but you may find that the default for your software would be a .avi. If you're taking your raw movie. So for example, you need to, in order to make a movie, and I'll sort of jump forward, you need to make a raw movie. And then there's two ways of playing that movie. You can either play it as a raw movie on your computer, but if you want to put it into a DVD player, it needs to be put into a DVD file format. The downloaded free version of Premiere does not come with Encore, which is the Premiere add-on for producing playable DVDs. The Apple default, which if you bought your Mac, comes with iDVD. So you can use Premiere, and you can pull your Premiere file into iDVD to make a playable DVD in the end, but it's preferable to do that with a .mov file, just for compatibility and to make it smooth. So that's quite possible. The codec is a way of encoding the audio and video, and it really does a bit of a compression. So if you take raw video footage, it's enormous. You may have a 20 gig movie that's, if you got something that's 2 hours long, like something you would go to see at the theater. In order to get that on a 4.7 gig DVD, it has to get compressed. So the raw file is the big one. The playable DVD goes through either iDVD or Encore, and it compresses it and reformats it so that it can be played. And so there are different codecs. For example, DivX is one of those formats that you may be trying to play on an Apple, and it will go, sorry, we don't do DivX. Or you may be trying to play, some Apple files on your PC, and it goes, can't open that one. Well, that is the codec, and it's buried inside. And so what you need to do when you are trying to start your project, based on whatever camera you own, is to try to figure out what your camera makes. Because that was going to influence the way that you set up the entire project. You want to make sure that your project matches whatever kind of footage your camera's making, whether or not it's a regular 4:3 format or a widescreen format or the pixel dimensions. You just need to examine whatever your camera's creating. So the old mini DV cameras that were based on tape were a standard 4:3 ratio, which matched people's televisions. And so you'll find most old TVs take 4:3 pretty well. As soon as you put a movie in there that's widescreen, you get those black bars at the top and the bottom. You can actually take widescreen and create letterbox by putting those bars top and bottom. Most current cameras have abandoned that format and are shooting widescreen. And widescreen ratio is 16:9, but you will find that the pixel dimensions vary. So yesterday when I was prepping this, I was sitting there with my calculator looking at all of the different shapes of things and going, well, because it's not necessarily intuitive if that's really 16:9, because you get into some of the big name movie producers, and they don't do 16:9 because that's too common. They want to do it really, really stretched, and so they pick some sort of more exotic format. So most of your cameras are going to be doing 16:9 shooting, but you need to know if it's a standard definition, if it's high definition. And what I would do is, I've got QuickTime Pro on my equipment. In QuickTime Player won't do it, but QuickTime Pro, you open something called Movie Inspector, and Movie Inspector will give you all of the details about your clip. So it will tell you the aspect ratio, it will tell you what kind of format it's in. It gives you all sorts of great information. Now I took a lot of the stuff that I'm using in the PowerPoint today out of this lovely little PDF I found, thank you Rice University, and I'll give people the group the PowerPoint, but that's a really good one to look up, because what it does is it actually moonwalks you backwards. If you're planning to post it on Vimeo, YouTube, or Facebook, it tells you all the best settings for those particular venues to influence you back to the beginning so that you can understand better how to set up your film. So if you're just not setting it up for a Phillips class or to put on a DVD player, that if you're planning to post stuff online, it tells you some of the better ways to approach it so you get a better result. One of the other complications over the years has been the change in frame rate. Different cameras have different frame rates. The most common one, and this comes back from the days of videotape cameras, is 29.97 frames per second. Don't ask me why. I have no idea. It rounds up to, they call it 30, but the actual rate is 29.97. My DSLR is running 23.96, which is equivalent to 24. And there are some other cameras that are running 25 frames per second. So you need to set up your project with your matching frame rate. So we'll show you how, as you go into the beginning, to set up the project, there's a whole bunch of options that you have to set up, or preferences based on what kind of camera you have, your aspect ratio, what you want it to turn out like in the end, and your frame rate. And you should not mix frame rates within your film. And that's where I would run into big problems trying to do compilations for my film course the last couple of years, because I have people giving me in 30 frames a second, 24 frames a second, 25 frames a second, and you can understand that it would be very difficult for software to accommodate all of those into one. Because if I've set it at 30 frames a second, what is it going to do with something that's put in at 25 frames a second? It could stretch it out or make it go 30 frames a second, which is going to change the speed of the way that clip is running. So you want to make sure that everything's consistent. And to just give you an idea of how horrible it really is, these are the most common formats. These are all the formats that you can get. So the two most common are 4x3 and 16x9. So you've got the 4x3 line here, and that feeds out into the boxes that feed into that line. And the 16x9 line is out here, and you can see all the ones that feed into that. And all of those other ones are also film formats. So depending what camera you have or where you're planning to put it, those are all the different sizes you can get. So this is a clip that I have opened up the QuickTime Movie Inspector. Now this clip was taken from my Nikon DSLR, and you can see when you look at the inspector, the top is the source, just tells me where it is on my computer. It tells me it's a .mov file, so that's good to know, because I've had other video, little still cameras that shoot video that are shooting .avi, and therefore you can't really mix those two in the same project. It tells me that the codec that's used is H.264. Now that's a very common Mac-based codec, so that's an important thing to know. So when you're exporting, if this is what I'm using to begin with, when I finally go to export the movie at the end of the project and I have a choice of a codec, it's really good to pick the one that the clip came in with, so that you're not trying to make it do something else. And there's all sorts of presets that are in the codec, which is really good to know when you're exporting so it doesn't screw up. I've had students give me things that they've exported, and it's their widescreen film has gone square on me, and we're going like, I'm sure it was fine on my computer. I'm sure it was too. So that tells me my format is 1920 by 1080, which is a standard. It's 16 by 9, but it's a progressive scan high-end image, so high definition. 16-bit integer little Indian stereo is a good and a common sound format, and it also tells me it's 48 kilohertz. Now 48 kilohertz is the standard, industry standard for sound in movies. And I'll talk about audio format if you're bringing in music. Music is not created to the same standards, which can cause problems. Here my frames per second of my movie is 23.98, which comes through as basically 24. The size of the clip is 29 megabytes, and there's a bunch of other things here. It says my normal size is 19 by 1080. My current size, which would have been whatever it was showing on my screen, was 960 by 540, and when I divided that through, it told me it was 16 to 9. Now, here's another clip. It was taken from an older camera, so this would be from my tape-based camera. And we can see here that it's, again, it's using an H.264 codec. It gives you a different 768 by 576, so it's a lower definition picture. It's the same audio, 29.97, so it's at 30 frames a second. And it's a much bigger data size. And it's a 4:3 aspect ratio. So if I were to take those two, if I were to set up a project that would be widescreen, 16:9, and throw that movie in on the timeline, what I will get are two black bars on the side. Because it won't stretch it, it'll just assume that I don't want to distort it, but it'll just plunk it in and replace the side with black. So if you put a whole bunch of clips together and they're different shapes, it gets kind of screwed up. Now I tried to import this one, I tried to open this one in QuickTime, and QuickTime refused to open it because it was a .avi file. It was running at 24 frames a second, and so it just wasn't going to work for me. If I really wanted to use this particular movie, I would have had to take it through a conversion on some external converting software in order to convert it from AVI to .mov. And depending on my setup, I have sometimes been able to make QuickTime do that, because you can use QuickTime Pro in order to convert file formats, but sometimes you have to just search online for other converters. It's better to make sure that you're shooting everything that fits together. So mixed formats can cause you trouble, not only for the size, so that you get the black bars on the side, which looks kind of ghetto, but the other thing that you will find too is that for some strange reason, the pixel dimensions are different on different file formats. I wonder if it shows pixels. It's not showing here. It shows in another shot. Coming into this, I've self-taught myself all of this stuff. When I started the film course, we were on campus, we were in environmental studies, and there was a really nice guy named Joe Bevan who used to run my Final Cut tutorials for me, so I just got to stand up in front of the class and appreciate the movies. And then we moved to campus, and then we moved to engineering, and there was nobody that knew anything about film editing software, so I had to learn it all in order to demonstrate it myself. So it's been a bit of a learning experience, but I found out when I was dealing with students that the image looked all right on their screen and they exported it and it was square, with the fact that different codecs and different films have different pixel ratios. So some of them are 1:1, which is what I would have thought a pixel was automatically square, but the automatic size in many film software, film sources, is 1 to 1.2121 repeated. So if you take something that's got a rectangular pixel and you export it through the wrong codec that thinks you got a 1:1, it'll actually take your film and squish it. So that's what happens there. Prepare your image files. Make sure that you import, before you get ready to import all of your image files, you need to prepare them so that they will all be in a folder so you can find them. The way that film editing software works, it takes the material that's on your hard drive, it doesn't change it, it makes another file, which is a set of instructions about what it wants to do to those pieces. So the instructions are based on where those pieces are. So if you are messy and you're just throwing a whole bunch of crap on your desktop and you import it from here and you import it from there and you've got something on a USB key and you've got something in Dropbox and you put all that stuff and you work on your movie file, if you move any of those things, they will go offline and they will disappear from your film, and you get some sort of a warning that your media is offline. And you're going like, what do you mean my media is offline? Well, you moved it. So the most straightforward way to save yourself a headache at the last minute, or if you're sharing a computer, etc., is to make sure that you've got everything in a file folder so that you know where it is, so it doesn't end up moving. Because you have to import all of this material into your editing software. it imports it, but it still imports it, but understands where it exists. And some clips you're going to be importing directly from your camera, depending on the camera. The image files, although Adobe Premiere, when I tried to import things into that, seems to be able to import almost anything. Again, to respond to an industry that's gone a bit wild. You're best off with JPEGs for your stills, if you're bringing in stills. The images should be at 72 DPI, so you don't need to bring in 300 DPI poster size print quality material. What has to happen when the film is rendered, and you understand from rendering 3D models, you know about rendering time? Rendering time is the same thing with film. And so if you're bringing in a huge poster size image into something that's ultimately going to be exported at 640 by 480, it has to get rid of all that data and compress it. What you don't want to do is to bring in anything that's smaller than your video is shot. So for example, if my video was 1920 by 1080 or whatever it was, I would want to make sure that the JPEGs I was bringing in were at least that big, so that when I would drop them into the timeline, my sequence line, that they would be coming in at the right size. If you bring in little clips that are smaller, whether it's a still image or something that you stole from YouTube that you want to include, if it's smaller than your project is shooting for, and you stretch it out to fill the screen, it's going to get really fuzzy because it's missing the data. It can't create data it doesn't have. So it's just like anything else. If you have a small JPEG and you try to make it fill a screen and it gets all fuzzy, there's nothing you can do about that. So you must make sure that the files are a good size. You can bring PSD files in. Now the fun thing about doing a PSD file is that the video editing software recognizes the layers. In fact, video editing software works with layers. So when you bring in and you drop and click a PSD, when you put it on your timeline, it'll burst it out into all of its layers. So if you want to move or set motion or transparency to all of those different layers, you can very easily do that in this video editing software if you're working with a PSD. The other thing that you can do really nicely too if you have a PSD is that you can make masks. So if you want to black out part of it, or make part of it opaque and leave a hollow or a solid, and I'll show you one that one of the other students did, which was like I'm driving in the car and this is what I'm seeing out of my front window, but he made the cutout really carefully so that he could underlay a movie in behind that, and that's kind of what they do in the movie industry. So you can do that by layer. Prepping your audio files. Check the QuickTime Inspector to see the audio rate that your film is using. So again, most of the audio rates that I have been using and that most people use is 48 kilohertz, and most should be in 16-bit, and it's stereo. I had one old mini DV camcorder. For some reason it was set up with 12-bit audio, which is just completely bizarre, which means it's not even evenly divided between left and right speaker, and it was a complete mismatch on the audio rate. So when you put it into the film, there was real sort of crackling and popping noises because it didn't know what to do about that. So make sure your audio format is consistent. When you add music, and very often people like to make their presentations kind of funky or sexy by putting some music in behind. My film course, everybody has to do an architecture music video, so it's necessary. But one of the things that you will find when you look at music is that music is normally produced 44.1 kilohertz. And so what you need to do in Final Cut Pro before you bring it in, Premiere seems to accommodate it much better internally. I think it must, when you import the music into Premiere, I think it fixes it, but Final Cut does not. You need to change it. So for example, there's some Radiohead CD music is an M4A, but you'll see that it's all 44.1 kilohertz, and that's some that Azo did for Nuit Blanche, and he self-recording, and it's MP3. So those are all coming through when I took them through QuickTime to examine what their audio rate was. Their audio rate was 44.1. So you can see over there. So what I'm trying to do is to export in QuickTime Pro. If you want to change the audio from 44.1 to 48, you can pull it into QuickTime Pro. Make sure that you're looking for audio files. Export, you want to go from sound to AIFF. QuickTime Pro is where you can take different kinds of movie formats in and change them to the one that you're working at. So if you have an MP3 and you want to change it to a .mov so everything's consistent, you can do that through QuickTime Pro, not Player. So it's coming in to 44.1, and I use that to change it to 48 and to export it. The other thing you can also do in QuickTime Pro is to truncate a song. If the song is too long and you're using some simpler software and you've run out of movie stuff and there's the song just keeps playing. I've had people hand me in movies that were really, really long. It's because they had a really, really long song, and so they exported it, but there's just like 3 minutes of blackness at the end of the movie, but the song just keeps playing. So you can actually go into QuickTime and chop the song off if you want. Setting up the film for editing. This is the opening screen of Adobe Premiere. So you launch the software, and you've got to start to pick what you want the movie to be like. And I'll show that for real. I just wanted to point out a couple of pointers. This is why it's really so complicated these days. These are all of the choices that you have on the opening screen to make the wrong decision as to how you want to set it up. In the olden days, we had a choice of the DV NTSC, whether we wanted it to be standard or widescreen. That was it. Nothing else. Now if you've got HDV camera, you have a choice between, that would be a 720 standard definition. That's either 24, 25, or 30 frames per second. So again, if you've gone into QuickTime and you look at whatever kind of clips your camera is creating, this is where this information becomes important. I had one poor guy, when we first moved to Cambridge, we had a bunch of Italian exchange students taking my course. And Francesco had to go back to Rome in order to do something for a job interview, and then he came back and he was doing this film project. He shot all of his footage in Rome on a borrowed camera, which was PAL, European PAL format. So he comes back to Cambridge and he's trying to export the movie onto our equipment, which was completely PAL incompatible. So the poor guy was trying to run around and find someplace. He ended up going to Toronto to find someplace very expensive that would transfer it. I mean, now, if in the future, a few years in the future, from 2004 till now, you could do it in Adobe Premiere. So things have come a long way. So when I got my ABC HD, that's the little thing at the top. If you've got Canons, they've got some specific cameras for you. And so there's all sorts of different ones. Mobile devices, you pull that one down and you can actually set it up that will go on an iPhone or the right size. So that's the sort of thing that you have to pick up. So here I've got widescreen 48 kilohertz highlighted for the baby on the left. So you can see what it's designated for at the top. That's its preset description. Time base 2997 frames per second. It gives you a frame size. And what it says beside the frame size is 1.2121. That's telling you that this particular format is using rectangular pixels. So if you're trying to mix something else in that has square pixels, then this isn't the right format for you. That's your sort of your audio set, your settings. So this one here, I've selected another one in HDV that's 720p24. So if we look here, this one's at 23.9 frames per second, and the pixel aspect ratio is 1. Okay, so most high definition newer cameras are using square pixels. So then you're going to import your video files. You're either going to be importing them as clips from your DSLR if you're using a DSLR, or if you have a video camera, then you're going to have to log them and capture them. So if you have a DSLR, the clips already exist as files. If you have a video camera, they exist in some bizarre format on the camera, and somehow they have to be extracted from the camera. Magic happens to them, and then they come into your video editing program. I'll show you how that works. Or a combination of the two. If you're working on something and somebody's shooting on a video camera and you shooting on your DSLR, that's when things get complicated, and you want to make sure that if you're doing a group project and using multiple camera equipment, that it's compatible. You should always shoot more than you need to allow for editing and throwing out garbage and trimming clips and shakiness. But don't shoot too much, or you end up having a lot of crap to sort through. Clips are easier to manage than a continuous shoot. So one of the things that's really interesting, and I haven't looked at this in Premiere, but in Final Cut Pro, when you import from the camera, say you've been working on stuff, and start, stop, you got 2 hours worth of stuff, and you import it and you have a piece of video that's an hour or two long. How the heck do you go through that piece of video and find the bits that you're looking for? It can be really nasty. However, if you start and stop the camera, there's something called Start Stop Detect. You click it, and Final Cut will just break the thing into all of its pieces. So it automatically breaks it into separate pieces that makes it a lot easier for you to sort through. So if you stop the camera, it starts to automatically slice the raw footage up into something that's easier to manage. Editing in Final Cut Pro, Premiere, and even the current versions of iMovie is all what we call non-destructive editing. And that comes from this idea that it's making some sort of a set of instructions to apply to a file folder of stuff, and it's leaving that stuff alone. It's leaving your files alone. So what this also means in Final Cut Pro and Premiere, that if you want to take a clip and put it onto your timeline many times, you can use things over and over and over and over again. You don't have to shoot it over and over and over again. You can just simply reuse it. And whenever you do to that clip, the clip that exists in your package or your file folder is still there as it was in the beginning to use. Audio files on multiple timelines will play all at once. So when you are putting images on the timeline, it's just like Photoshop. You know how Photoshop is layered? And whatever is on the upper level of layers is the one that shows, and the things that are below all sit below. Well, the same thing works when you're making a movie. So whatever you have on the highest number of line on your sequence is what's on top, and everything else is sitting in behind. So you use that same way you would do in Photoshop. Now, audio all plays at once. So audio is not layered. So if you have music playing, you've got somebody talking, and you got some sound effects, they're all right on top of each other, and they just kind of all work together. So you have to manually set the audio levels to do what we call ducking, where you actually, as soon as somebody speaks, if there's music playing, you want to make that music, decrease in volume and then increase in volume. So that's stuff you do manually. And then the last little piece I'll show you before I start to show you the software itself is the sequence line. I've been talking about the sequence line. Both Final Cut and Premiere let you create film sequences. So it's not called a movie, it's called a sequence. There are unlimited video tracks up to like 99. I would never ever be using this little MacBook Air to do video editing. I have actually, it just died last week. I had this really nice 27-inch screen, and it just died. So I'll have to replace it next before I do video editing, because you want to be able to see as many as possible so that you can keep track of what you're working on. And then the same thing with unlimited audio tracks at the bottom. So you can imagine if I was doing something for On Silent Night a couple years ago, and I was working with, at one point in the film, 28 video tracks and about 8 audio tracks, and you're trying to keep track of what you're working on. It was a little bit hairy. What you can do when you're editing, though, is if you have something really complicated that you're making in terms of video and audio, you can make that as a sequence, save it as a sequence, then start on another piece, and you can take that one little sequence and you can pop it into the new one so that it doesn't get touched. So you don't have to worry about it getting wrecked. If you've got a piece that's finished, or if you've got that sequence of, something all of a sudden happening and you want to use it a few times, then instead of cutting and pasting a whole bunch of tracks multiple times onto your timeline, save it as a sequence and then drop that sequence into your tracks. iMovie, and I do want to mention iMovie for the Mac because it's underrated. People go, oh, I would never use iMovie. I use iMovie all the time. It has, biggest issue, it only has one video track. It has an audio track that's stereo, so if you want to put music in, you've got that, and it's got a voiceover track. And it's got pretty easy ways to put on titles. So very often I will do that if I'm doing something simple where I'm taking a series of video sequences. I want a transition in between them. I want some words on top of them. I want a title. I want credits, and I want to throw it onto YouTube. I will do that because it's very, very fast.